Would you take your Bibles for a few moments tonight and turn to John 21? John 21. I spent time in John chapter 20, of course, this morning. And we're looking at the last chapter tonight for a few moments. John 21. This morning we looked at Jesus' confrontation of unbelief in his resurrection. And I mentioned there were kind of four categories we worked with in terms of trying to think about his activities after resurrection, before his ascension. There was that provision of evidence to his resurrection. And then there was that confrontation of unbelief. And then we talked about the fact there's restoration that follows after his resurrection. And then even that proclamation of life through his resurrection. And tonight, in the passage we're looking at, we're giving time and attention to his restoration of purpose after the resurrection. As we come to this passage, I'll just make a few comments and then raise a couple questions to get our minds engaged here. Then we'll read our text. But as we come here, we have to remember that a shadow, to some degree, still stretches over Jesus' disciples. And that shadow is something that, without this account, we really wouldn't have indication of how it's resolved. That is in direct connection to Peter's denial of Jesus. And raises questions. An unspoken, unresolved issue, Peter's repeated denial. Is such repeated denial or failure in a disciple of Jesus final, or is it forgivable? Right? This experience of Peter really raises a question like that. Or this, what does Jesus think of such failure? How does he view this? Or even this, if not final, what possible prospects exist in the future of such a fallen follower of Christ? Right? All these questions that begin to surface a little bit as we think about Peter and his denial. And I'm thankful for this chapter of John's Gospel because it follows so well after that kind of closing solicitation to believe the things that have been given, the signs that have been put in front, believe this. And then there's this realization in the following accounts that there's work to be done still, and Jesus isn't working with perfect material. And so I really appreciate this last chapter. I want to read together verses 15 through 19 to get into our text, and then we'll give some thought to these words. When they had eaten breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said to him. "You know that I love you." "Feed my lambs," Jesus told him. A second time Jesus asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," he said to him. "You know that I love you." "Shepherd my sheep," he told him. Jesus asked him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved that he asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." "Feed my sheep," Jesus said. "Truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will tie you and carry you where you don't want to go." He said this to indicate by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. After saying this, he told him, "Follow me." Again, this is an account unique to John's gospel record. And the account details Jesus' restoration, we could say it that word, the restoration of Peter. And there's three probing questions. You saw those, and perhaps this is a familiar text for us. These recall Peter's threefold denial of our Lord. And Jesus manages to do this whole conversation without ever directly bringing up Peter's failure. But a reader reading this, you immediately, your mind goes to the very instance just days before of Peter 3 times denying his Lord. Ringing in our ears as we read this, we need to keep Peter's own boastful words in mind. Let me read them from the Gospel of Mark. Peter told Jesus, "Even if everyone falls away, I will not." "Truly, I tell you," Jesus said to him, "today, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But Peter kept insisting, "If I have to die with you, I will never deny you." And they all said the same thing. And within a few hours, of course, Peter fulfilled Jesus' words with his denial 3 times. And that shadow is finally addressed sometime after Jesus' second appearance, that appearance that we saw this morning with Thomas. That's a week after. And then chapter 21 opens with, and kind of continues on with the story. After that, at some point, the story continues. So we're at least a week past the resurrection of Jesus, possibly even as much as 10 days. We don't know exactly, but a time after that. And Jesus finally approaches the disciples back at the Sea of Galilee. After they'd eaten, Jesus probes Simon with a series of questions. And I want to look at these in order, give some thought to them. What we're going to do is just work our way to the very end when I have 3 considerations to give us as to what do we make of this account? What do we do with this? How do we think about it? So the first question contains a comparison. Do you love me more than these? And there's really 3 options when it comes to what is Jesus talking about there. More than what? More than these. There's 3 options typically seen. 2 of them are better than the third. But one option would be this: more than the other disciples loved Jesus. So in other words, Jesus is saying, Peter, do you love me more than these other disciples love me? And that has the strength of Peter's confession and that statement way back in Gospel of Mark when he says, Lord, though everyone else fall away, I will not. And Peter's making a statement there that my love's stronger than theirs. So that has a possibility. The second option is this. Maybe Jesus is saying, Peter, do you love me more than you love these other disciples? That's the weakest option. It's possible, but it's the weakest option. We don't really have any context, other scriptures that give us a strong indication that Peter's got this strong love for those around him. I'm sure they're his fellow disciples, but we don't really have any indication to really go strongly that way. And third, maybe Jesus is saying, Peter, do you love me more than these, being the fish and the fishing that Peter had just come back from on the lake? And that's, of course, got specific contextual support right in this passage. All of these are reasonable interpretations. The first and the third have the most scriptural support. I personally think Jesus is bringing Peter back to his original claim that he made that, Lord, though everyone else run away, I will never do that. And then boom, 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 Peter denies the Lord. So I would personally go that direction. Either way you land there, you're not going to be in error. It's probably a bit of a preference in where you see the context lining up. But in essence, Peter's he's claimed he loved Jesus the most. And again, personally, Jesus' question, I think, revisits that. Peter responds positively here, but he drops any comparison. Notice he doesn't say, yes, Lord, I love you more than these. No, it's just, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus responds with responsibility for Peter. Notice it here. He says, feed my lambs. We'll come back to that in a moment. That's the first round. There's a comparison. Peter doesn't respond with the comparison, but it's definitely going to begin opening things in Peter's heart and his mind, his conscience. The second question comes without a comparison. It's stated simply, do you love me? And Peter again responds affirmatively, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus' response this time varies a little bit from the previous. Here's the responsibility now, shepherd my sheep. And there does seem to be some progression, some adjustment in these responsibilities that Jesus is giving Peter. For example, one commentator, Colin Kruse, in his New Testament commentary observes this. Jesus' first commission to Peter was to feed his lambs, meaning he was to provide spiritual nourishment for new believers. Jesus' second commission to Peter is to take care of his sheep, implying pastoral care of believers generally. Possible. The third question is posed to Peter, though, do you love me? And this time, John tells us, he inserts a little bit of a narrator's comment. He says, Peter is grieved. It pained him to hear Jesus press this question again. And I want to just pause for a moment and comment on something here. You might be familiar with this from other things you've read or heard, but John uses a couple different words for love here. He uses two different Greek words. He uses one Greek word for Jesus' first two questions, and then he uses the other Greek word for all of Peter's answers in Jesus' third question to Peter. And some have made a good bit of that grammatical language change, arguing that Jesus' first two questions are asking Peter if he loved Jesus with a supreme love, and all Peter could muster as an answer was, Lord, I love you with an affectionate love. The main problem with that, there is a problem with that, the main problem with that is that John actually uses both Greek words interchangeably throughout his gospel. So, for example, in John 5:20, Jesus says the Father loves the Son. He uses the word that Peter uses. Well, just later in John 10, Jesus says, this is why the Father loves me. He uses the other word. So, does the Father love with supreme love the Son, or does the Father love with affectionate love the Son? Well, both. It's used interchangeably. Even this happens in John 11, speaking of Jesus' love for Lazarus. In that short chapter, it's mentioned a couple times that he loved Lazarus, and both words are used. With affectionate love, with supreme love, if you want to use those two ideas. And this happens as well to use the Father's love for the disciples in John 14 and then John 16. Speaking of the Father's love for disciples, for the disciples, he loves them. And both words are used. So this is kind of a pattern of John to just basically use them interchangeably, really with no specific thinking in mind here to make a real strong point. And I think it's strengthened by this fact that our English translations, to my knowledge, don't make a visible distinction here. They just use the word love. So I say that to say this. Let's be careful we don't miss the forest for the trees here. The forest is this, the primary issue. Does Peter love Jesus? And the primary issue for us as disciples, as we're going to look at in a moment, is do we love our Lord? All right, but let's go on to the next one. Peter's response grows a bit in intensity with addition of some words. Lord, here we go, you know everything. Almost you get this sense that maybe Peter's a little bit not exasperated, but just, Lord, you know everything. You know I love you. And Jesus again issues Peter responsibility, again a little bit different, feed my sheep. Maybe a little bit more, again, to reference Cruz, Peter was maybe here to provide spiritual nourishment for believers generally. But Jesus goes on then to describe Peter, for Peter, his death, giving a description that really is a description of crucifixion. He's going to have his hands stretched. He's going to have them tied. He's going to be carried somewhere he doesn't want to go. And tradition holds that Peter was indeed crucified. He was, according to tradition, crucified upside down because he viewed it as an unworthy thing to die the same way his Lord died. But then Jesus ends with this succinct charge in verse 19. Notice these couple of words. He says this, follow me. All right, what do we make with this account? I want to give you quickly 3 considerations to take away and work with, and hopefully these help us really think through some ramifications for our own lives. And I want to start with that final charge to Peter and go kind of work backwards. So first of all, this, following Christ is my singular responsibility today. You know, isn't Jesus gracious to give Peter some wonderful responsibility again in the work of the kingdom? I mean, here's the man who just days before had denied the Lord 3 times, and here's Jesus bringing him back in and going, Peter, I've got work for you to do. And we can look at the book of Acts, we can look and read the epistles that Peter wrote, and we can see his work of shepherding the sheep, feeding the flock, taking care of the lambs, doing the work that God gave him to do. This didn't make Peter better than the others. Some theologians have drawn a conclusion here that somehow Jesus is putting Peter up on kind of a superior pedestal here. Well, that's not the case. He's going to talk about John later on. John takes a pretty prominent place throughout this chapter as well. But we do see Peter picking up the responsibility here. But as with Peter, here's the singular responsibility facing each of Christ's disciples. Follow Christ. I think that's so helpful. We don't know what the future holds. You or I may not ever be in charge of a local assembly a different way or a family, but we have this charge before us: follow Christ. If that's all Jesus gave to Peter and follow in the aftermath of his own failure, that would be enough. That would be wonderful. Peter, it's okay. You can still follow me. Glorious. Christians can get so caught up in dealing with past failure or discerning the future that we neglect following Christ today. And this chapter finishes with Peter even looking over at another disciple and asking what Jesus has in mind for him. Yet another distraction to Christians, comparing ourselves with others when our responsibility is to follow Christ. Follow him. Following Christ is my singular responsibility today. If I can keep that in front of me, whatever else God puts on my plate, whatever else comes my way, whatever trips and falls I make, I can keep this in front. Second, following Christ does not eliminate failure. I think this is a good reminder. Peter is the disciple who confessed publicly and powerfully that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He's the leader in that confession. In the passages we have, he's the one to step out first and go, I know who you are. Peter's the one who's perhaps one of the earliest to be called by Jesus as a disciple. But zeal for Christ does not eliminate failure as a follower of Christ. I think, again, this is so helpful for us. A Christian thinking correctly about his or her sin can spiral very quickly into doubt and despair. Or we can see another believer falter in his or her walk with God. Maybe someone we've put kind of up on a pedestal and gone, wow, they've really got something, a walk with God there. And then, they tripped, they fell. And there is a bit of a shock. But don't we realize that following Christ doesn't eliminate failure? Peter reminds us of this. This is not to excuse such failure, but it should prevent us from throwing up our hands in despair. The third thing I would say is this: following Christ, and this I think is perhaps the primary point, if nothing else, of this passage. Following Christ consists primarily in love for Christ. Do you love me? It's interesting, Jesus' words to Peter highlight Peter's failure was ultimately a failure to love. I mentioned Jesus manages to do this whole thing without ever talking about the denial specifically, at least according to record. But I think he does talk about the denial specifically by dealing with the root issue. Peter, do you love me? Peter's failure ultimately was a failure to love. When Jesus addressed the hardworking Orthodox church at Ephesus in Revelation 2, he points out their failure is one of love. They had abandoned their first love. And this echoes what Jesus himself stated as the first and great command. You know the words, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Love for Christ is not seen in comparison with others. Careful. I really do appreciate Peter dropping the comparison there. I think that was probably a wise thing. Lord, I'm not even going to try and compare. I just know this: I do love you. And if I start looking around at others and trying to compare, I either get arrogant or I become despairing and discouraged. So let's deal with me, Lord. and know my heart. I love you. Love for Christ is seen in my acts of obedience to God. So if you would follow Christ, you must love Christ. Do you love him? Close with this. May we be able to answer with Peter, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. What a grace-filled response to a failure where Jesus takes that and turns it around and brings us right back to where we need to be. Following Christ is my singular responsibility today. Following Christ does not eliminate failure. Following Christ consists primarily in love for Christ. May God help us cultivate that and grow in that.